Yeah, we'll do this very quickly. I'm Dan McIntyre. I've worked in expanded access since 2010 in ALS, SMA, and spinal muscular atrophy and Alzheimer's disease. And I've advised three companies on ALS expanded access over the last now 12 years. Sonya, I'll do you, Sonya. Sonya is head of government affairs and policy for IMALS. Extraordinary background in biopharma, in government, and in advocacy, and we're delighted that she's with us tonight. And Troy, I think you should say something about yourself because
Sure.
you have a really cool thing that just happened, and I want you to say
Uh,
it.
okay. So I'm Troy Fields. I'm a co-chair of the Legislative Affairs Community Team with IMALS. I am also a person living with ALS and just recently um, named as the patient representative for the latest EAP grant for the drug Ibutilas, which was approved by NIH just about a month ago.
Thanks. Julie, next. Thanks. So tonight we're going to go through some very quick background, the history of expanded access, uh, because context is really important in this case. Some background on expanded access in general, how they have worked and how they work now, and then some very specific information on the Act for ALS and its impact on EAPs, some where to find information, and then we hope to have a robust and discussion. So we're hoping to get through this talk in 20 minutes or so. Next slide, please. Yeah, there are really four traditional ways for people to get access to therapies. Obviously, the FDA approved. The traditional is really good. If it to the extent that it's possible, the FDA, has follows rigorous standards. The problem in ALS is that in the last 80 or 90 years, there are only three therapies available. Really, is all has been around since the 90s. It really hasn't showed any uh, quality of life improvement. It does extend life for a short period. Radicava has in now multiple trials shown to reduce progression roughly one third, although in a heterogeneous condition like ALS, it's hard. And Qalsody, which is for Biogen's new drug, and Ionis for a fairly rare variant of ALS. Clinical trials are the next logical avenue, but the entry criteria tend to be very strict in ALS, partly due to the heterogeneity of it, and partly for other reasons. The trials tend to be fairly small. The largest I've ever seen was 1,000 people, and I don't think that'll ever come again. There are generally a couple of hundred people in both the treatment and the control arms. And logistics generally can be extremely difficult. Investigator-sponsored initiatives more rare. Some of them are off-label uses. We've seen Librium, and there have been instances where people have at great pain and expense gone outside the U.S. to places like Japan and Korea for drugs that are approved there, but not yet here. Radicava is an example in the past, and now there are a couple of other neurobus now approved in Italy, and I'll mispronounce it, Eisai's drug in Japan. And then finally, expanded access to what we're here to talk about, and the three types of expanded access that we've seen. Again, specifically, um, Act for ALS a little bit later. Next slide, please. The notion of expanded access actually predates this timeline. I'm just going to go back a little bit farther to 1962 when the FD&C Act amendments were passed, the Kefauver-Harris amendments. And they were they for the first time, drugs were required to show safety and efficacy in order to be marketed. That was in response to the thalidomide calamity in Europe and to a lesser extent in Canada. And a small team of FDA regulators refused to approve it in this country and averted that disaster here. The reason it's important today is that experience became a major element of FDA's culture, and it really has shaped and colored the way FDA looks at itself. So when we sometimes we think they're too cautious and too slow, that's at least part of the reason. In the 19, but it's the first expanded access programs were in cancer in the 70s. The points about that are important are that those are drugs that were distributed by the NIH, and they had to show very specific relative and reproducible effectiveness, and they were for specific tumor types. So they're very restricted. Fast forward to the 1980s, the AIDS community mobilized, and it became an action-forcing mechanism. It changed the way communities looked at advocacy and how they dealt with FDA. And it led to some important steps: the investigator IND, emergency INDs, and treatment INDs. We'll talk about that, and fast track approval, which shortened the regulatory process. In the early 90s, the FDA introduced the concept of accelerated approval. That really the main point there was surrogate endpoints. In cancers, it was tumor shrinkage and things of that. So length of survival became part of a much more more full look at it. Sorry about that. Then in the 2000s, with increasing patient advocacy, FDA created these additional pathways. The main one is the treatment IND at the end of that list, which really enabled large treatment protocols. The first one ever that was done under that process was Gleevec, the Novartis's cancer drug. Fast forward to the 2010s, a couple of things happened, and again, these were largely initiated by the community. Josh Hardy, who is a young boy with cancer, developed an adenovirus after a bone marrow transplant and requested expanded access, compassionate use from the sponsor, which was a pre-commercial small company that had no money. They declined, and they started a Facebook initiative. And that whole process, the CEO lost his job. The company reversed its decision, and he actually responded to their antibiotic for the virus that he had. Unfortunately, he ultimately succumbed to his cancer not that long afterward. But it really showed the power and speed with which social media could make a difference. That whole process was 4 days, by the way, from the initial rejection to the reversal. The Congress, these are in chronological order, but the Right to Try Act, which was signed into law in 2018, had momentum for a number of years, and it really was the impetus for the 21st Century Cures Act, which required for the first time companies to publicly communicate their expanded access policies. It was a fairly significant step. It hasn't had a lot of traction since then. But then in the 2020s, something that IMALS, as most of you know, was largely responsible for, the Act for ALS, created a process and funding mechanism for expanded access programs by small pre-commercial companies, which are most of the ones who are doing um, ALS research. Next slide, please. This is FDA's definition of expanded access, and that's their preferred term. Compassionate use is probably more widely known or it's been used for longer. But I think the idea, you see what's called out in italics in red are the key elements. The point that makes is that EAP is considered a last resort for people who can't get any access to therapy any other way and have no options. And it still comes with conditions. The sponsors have to make and distribute the drug. Clinicians have to be able to administer it, monitor for safety signals, and payers have to reimburse to some degree, or unless people who are of wealth. And the FDA still has to review all of them and approve them. Next slide, please. A couple of really important things, because in the right to try debates going from about 2014 to 2018, there was some misconceptions about what this is. What expanded access is a humane way to provide potentially valuable therapies to some, not all, who have no other options. And under Act for ALS, it's a potential tool to gain real world data, and that comes with issues as well. What it isn't is a clinical trial. I mean, the Act for ALS has a research requirement. It's not broad availability. Even in the best, most generous circumstance, many more people will want access under EAP than will be able to get it. It's a tragically scarce resource, and it's not, as I said, it's not guaranteed access to a drug. The drug sponsors have to agree to it. These things can be extremely costly, particularly if they're injectable. And the FDA again still has to approve it. And at the same time, there's risk. They may pose risk that hasn't been seen in research. And FDA is still trying to balance, even though they want to expand access, they're still trying to balance what they see as a mission to protect people from products that might be useless, harmful, or both. Next slide, please. When a sponsor or a physician is considering an expanded access protocol, whether it's individual, small group, or a large one, they have to take into account a lot of different things, and the context is everything. Some diseases, again, just cry out for an accommodation. At the same time, there are critical populations such as children who need greater care, even though they're the ones who are the most heart-wrenching cases. The drug sponsor, again, in ALS, a lot of companies that don't have the resources to do this and pursue their clinical program at the same time. And in some conditions, particularly Alzheimer's, where there's a lot of research going on, they have to make sure that they're not delaying enrollment in other trials and slowing down the process for everybody. Experience, the state of knowledge and research in an indication and in a drug is really important. We still have serendipity drugs that we not sure of the mechanism of action. Amylyx's drug was like that. Biogen's first ALS drug was like that. And the treaters as well. The people who have to administer this have to know how to administer it. They have to be sensitive to safety signals, and they have to provide a lot of reporting to the sponsors, who then have to report to FDA. So there's a lot that goes into it. And then, of course, there's a level of risk. Rescue is a case in point is Josh Hardy, who I mentioned a while ago. He was an individual who had no option. He was going to die, and there was some rationale for the potential value of Chimerix's drug, and that made it argued for that use. And of course, the pandemic is a great example too. So many of the treatments, including vaccines, were available through emergency use authorization because of the calamity that we were facing. And again, and then the relationship, as I said, the relationship to other clinical research and FDA's expectations, and that can be FDA's expectations can be dicey. We'll put it that way. And when sponsors look at these things, you don't always get the same answer. You still need to do the risk benefit, and you still have to make sure that you're not infecting the process with morally inferior decision making, ability to pay, status, connections, and things of that sort. Next slide, please. And the key here is it all has to start with people with lived experience. As I said at the outset, you have to be your own advocates. You have to seek information about clinical trials, drug sponsored programs, any kind of research, and you have to be assertive about talking to the physician to learn if you may be a candidate. Neurologists often aren't aware of some of the more cutting edge things. They're treating patients day to day. They might be or they might not be. So it's really up to you. The physician then has to agree to oversee the treatment. They have to make the request from the drug company. Even if the company has agreed to it, it has to start there traditionally. Somebody has to decide about insurance, and then the institution has to file paperwork with the FDA. IRBs can be notoriously slow, particularly in the large academic institutions who have really good ALS clinics, but those IRBs have all sorts of competing priorities, and then they have to be responsible for patient care and following AERs. The company has to be willing and able to provide the medical product. They have to distribute it. They have to track it. They have to keep control of it. And then they have to either use their IND or allow a FDA and the physician to create another one. And sometimes that happens. And they're still accountable for reporting all adverse drug reactions to the FDA. The FDA, again, is the final arbiter on all of these things, and everything has to be reviewed and approved by them. They generally are pretty fast. They can do it in a matter of a couple of days. And they also tend to be very helpful in that regard, but it's still an extra step. Okay. Thank you. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Troy.
Thanks, Dan. So we're going to take now a closer look at how the Act for ALS has affected the EAP, as Dan just described them, and how they differ from those company-sponsored EAPs. Now, while the law was actually signed by President Biden in December 2021, there's actually a whole movement that started way before then, pushing Congress in order to enact the Act for ALS. And I know that there's probably some folks in this call now, or folks that might watch the video later, that were responsible for making Act for ALS possible. It is probably one of the biggest advocacy achievements within the ALS community, or at least as of the last several years. Now, it's important to understand that Act for ALS has multiple parts. It includes a public and private partnership and other components. We're going to focus on one specific aspect of the Act for ALS, which is the one related to expanded access programs. Before I go into as far as the grant process and how it works, I just want to make one other statement with regards to Act 4 ALS. Act 4 ALS was authorized for a 5-year period. However, every year we need to ask for funding and make sure that there's adequate funding every one of those 5-year periods in order to make sure that there's enough money for grants to be approved. And we'll talk a little bit about that towards the end. So grants for research are actually come out of funding that Congress approves, as I said, every fiscal year. And the monies are actually allocated to the National Institute of Health, which of course operates under the General Department of Health and Human Services, more specific to what is called an INDS, the National Institute for Neurological Diseases and Stroke. And they're the ones responsible for administering the grants. Grants are awarded primarily to smaller organizations as per the terms of Act 4 ALS. And they need to have a scientific research component that goes along with the expanded access for the individuals. And individuals that participate in the expanded access programs are folks who are otherwise not eligible for clinical trials. The applicant submits that application to, as I said, ultimately an INDS, who would then review the application for its merits. The application will not only outline the expanded access protocols as far as number of patients that will be administered and so on, but it will also include the protocols for the research components. Like I said, they go hand in hand as part of the grant application. And the grants are intended to cover the direct cost of providing the drug, basically getting that particular investigational treatment produced and distributed, as well as the direct and indirect costs of conducting research for that investigational drug. Next. Now, what does Act 4 ALS, specific with respect to EAPs, mean to the ALS community overall? It means that there's more resources for institutions and sponsors to have to conduct research. So you have, as I mentioned, covers the cost for smaller sponsors or pharmaceuticals to be able to then offer some of these treatments, some of whom would not have had the resources necessarily to offer expanded access without the government grant. It looks at the administration and reporting by the ALS clinics or expanded access sites, because now as a government program, we'll see that it's actually those clinics and sites that are actually in the driver's seat of getting the EAP up and running. And by having government sponsorship, you're able to, the process is slightly different than waiting for the request, as we saw in the commercial or company-sponsored EAPs. We also have, as I mentioned, the research requirement. And so as these treatments are made available under expanded access, those clinics or sites are collecting and analyzing data that is tied in to into the overall EAP, and those folks receiving the drugs then participate within that research process. Now, the research may be, for example, they're not necessarily looking at if the drug was effective or so on, although that's part of the data that they will report on. But remember that the research part of these EAP programs do not affect the results of clinical trials. They're separate and apart. So that's not really what their main thing that they're after. They're after things like collecting or looking at the impact of certain biomarkers and see how those change over the course of that research time period during the EAP. Participants will have to visit the clinics, not only because they need to receive their treatment, but also to be able to be part of that research. And people with lived experience need to understand that not every EAP is necessarily the right EAP for them. So they need to take a look at the various EAPs and determine which program might be best suited for them, be it the site locations or the research responsibilities that may come with it. And they need to go and request participation in that program. Usually sites put out and start to recruit for the EAPs, but it's that person with lived experience that raises their hand and says, I want to be a part of it. Next. Now, who are the players in expanded access under Act for ALS? Well, some of the same folks that we saw in the slide that Dan presented for commercial EAPs or company-sponsored EAPs. But there's a couple of differences. The main one is that the process is actually started by what is called a primary investigator. Primary investigator is might be a clinic director or some researcher, neurologist that has an interest in being able to administer the EAP, the expanded access component, and direct the associated research activity that goes with it. And that primary investigator, or PI, will submit a grant application that goes up to NIH, as I said, more specifically NINDS within NIH. NIH will review that particular grant application and determine the merits of the EAP and the research component together, and make a determination to award that particular grant. The people with lived experience then sign up for that particular EAP. Now they have to find the sites where the EAP is offered, and there's different references that we provided there that folks can use to try to find EAPs in their area or understand the particulars of the EAP so they can make the right determination as to whether that EAP is the right one for them. Of course, they can also consult with their neurologist at clinic in order to determine if there's an EAP that's available to them and to get some further information with respects to that particular EAP. We have the physicians. They don't necessarily have to be the head of the clinic. Sometimes you have other neurologists that will sign up as part of the EAP, but they have similar obligations, right? They're the ones that are working with the person with lived experience. They're the ones that are administering the treatments. They're the ones that are gathering the specifics with regards to the clinical trials, and ultimately are the ones that are reporting on the data as the research continues and ultimately concludes. You have the company or drug sponsor who works hand in hand with the primary investigator because the primary investigator, in order to submit the grant, has to indicate what's the treatment that will be part of the EAP. And so usually the primary investigator and the company or drug sponsor are working already in conjunction to ensure that there's going to be enough product to cover, looking at the distribution of the product to the various sites and so on, looking at the logistics to ensure that then once they receive the grant approval, they're able to hit the ground running. And of course, the FDA. FDA has to review all the EAP applications as well and look at the protocols that are part of that grant application to ensure that that the plan is sound, that there's basis for the clinical study, that it's for the research study, I should say, that is part of that particular EAP. And there's one more player that is not listed here, but of course is NINDS, who will be receiving the grants and approving the grants, but will also have responsibility to check in to see the progress of how the EAP is doing and ensuring that there's certain things that need to be reported to them, and ultimately they report back to Congress with the status of the various EAPs. Next. Now here is a listing of the EAP grants that have been approved. Now there's 5 that have been approved so far since Act for ALS became law, but only 4 are currently active. The first one that was part of the 2022 grant process was stopped because the drug was found not to be effective. But the others are in some stage of recruitment or about to start kicking off recruitment in a few months. So you'll have some information with respect to when the grant was approved, the fiscal year for government purposes as to where the funding would come from, the drug, the company, who the primary investigator is, and the institution they're affiliated with, and then the number of spots and participating sites. Now, if you do some quick math, you will see that there's 620 available spots on those EAPs, and yet, maybe about 30,000 of us or so that are living with ALS. So as Dan indicated in his part of the presentation, it's not enough to cover everybody, but certainly it's significantly more access to treatments that we would have had without it. And so it's yet another mechanism for access, all the while gathering significant research information that will ultimately keep moving that, getting us closer to potential treatments and cures. Next. Now, where do I find this information? Well, there's several sources. IAMALS and ALS TDI, for example, have general information about clinical trials, which include EAPs as part of their listings. And then the various sponsors usually have their webpage, which you can actually look at their EAPs that they're offering, and those are listed. We'll make these links available to you, so you don't need to worry. They'll be part of information that that you can receive. There's also general EAP information by the FDA that explains what expanded access is, and some definitions and other resources that could be useful. Next. Now, I said about how Act for ALS was the result of an intensive effort by so many ALS advocates that were just relentless and got Congress to ultimately pass this law and by significant margins, I should say, as far as the approval and passage of the law. But funding, as I said, is not guaranteed, even though the law is authorized for 5 years. So every year we need to knock on doors and get them to fund for that fiscal year. So we still have grants for 2025 and 2026 coming up that will depend on us as advocates ensuring that Congress funds these EAP programs under the Act for ALS. And we need you to help us achieve that. And so I wouldn't do my job as co-chair of the Leg team if I didn't mention a shameful plug. But there's the link if you want to join us in that advocacy effort. And also getting your member of Congress to be part of the ALS caucus, because that also gets them to buy in to these ALS-related, causes, including Act for ALS. Next. I guess at this point we open it up for questions.
And Julie, I think there were some comments in the chat too.
Yeah, so in the chat, so first, and as Troy said, we will make these slides available to you all and send it. So you don't need to worry about accessing the link. So somebody had just sent a message about that. So don't worry, we will send those out. MCore says my brother has C9 mutation ALS. He's having no luck getting into any trial. We make contact and never hear back. This is the third webinar I've been on when everyone is talking about deciding on trials and we can't even get one. What do you suggest? Reaching out to doctors or drug companies? How often? My brother is being treated at Columbia, but has also been to Johns Hopkins and willing to travel to Mass General. And Diane responded, our one of our co-chairs, who said, how frustrating for your family. You're going to some top clinic, so hopefully you'll get the info you are looking for. I don't think there's one approach. It may just take repetitive attempts. You can check for recruiting trials at als.net/ALS Trial Navigator. And Brett asked how much of the money allocated for Act for ALS is being utilized. And Sonya, our government relations officer, said, hi, Brett, all of the money appropriated by Congress for each fiscal year is utilized. Congress directed NIH in regards to their priority for the funding, with EAP being primary and separate from other research on ALS. Congress also directed NIH to fund the grants in 1-year increments, which is the norm for NINDS grants. And this was directed by Congress after the first year grant to Trehalose was made as a multi-year award. Liz says, wasn't there a 300-person EAP with RAPA 501 that was recruiting? I don't know if anyone has any information on that.
Julie, to the first question, I'm sorry, we're not qualified or authorized to give any advice in terms of navigating this yourself, but in terms of getting into trials for your brother, I think it's one of the things that's important to really wrap our heads around is the enrollment criteria for them. Generally, they require a diagnosis less than 2 years from the time of enrollment in the trial. They have requirements for physical function measured by LSFRSR, lung capacity, and sometimes the rate of progression. And there, just knowing that about your brother might actually help you understand or see whether there's a whether there's some sort of an obstacle based on that. And then that's when you really start looking hard for expanded access programs.
Yeah, and if I could add, making that distinction between clinical trials that have very specific inclusion criteria and EAP, which is designed for folks that do not qualify for clinical trials. And so a person's particular experience with respect to a particular clinical trial might be different and should be different than that if they're participating in an EAP, by virtue of the fact that EAPs target effectively those folks that otherwise would not qualify for a clinical trial. And then, Julie, you read the other question about Robin. So that's a smaller EAP. So there may be another activity that they might be doing that has a larger number. But ROP is one of the smaller trials by virtue of the fact of the way that that particular treatment has to be administered. And so it's much more, it's smaller just to deal with some of the logistics of getting those treatments into patients.
And Rob said, Liz said, sorry, I found what I was looking for. But Rob also put in the chat that he sees a 40-person EAP for RAPA, and he put the clinical trial number right next to it.
And there's also a question from Nancy. What percentage of ALS patients seeking expanded access get in one? Julie, I'm not sure we could answer that question yet. The three EAPs that are currently recruiting, RAPA, CLEAN, and Prelenia. I've not heard any numbers that have said that like they've had 100 people or 200 people or 300 people want to participate relative to their number of slots. I don't know if anybody else has heard anything about that. So I'm not aware of or able to give you a direct answer to that question. But I think obviously, as Troy said, there are 30,000 people with ALS living at any given time. And we know that there are only 620 slots of the currently recruiting. And then we do have the addition of the award just with Ibutalas that will add another 200 people. But even at 820, it's a low percentage of the total number of people living with the disease.
I would also highlight that the percentage of ALS patients getting access in an EAP before Act for ALS was far lower than whatever the statistic's going to be once we get the numbers by the end of this year, because it was essentially non-existent. There was very few opportunities for EAP, and certainly not at the level and opportunity that is occurring now after Act for ALS, I think. So anyways. But we can certainly get that once it's available at Nancy publicly.
Any other questions from anyone on the call today?
Julie, if I can add just one thing when talking about recruiting for EAPs, understanding that you'll see within that list of the active EAPs that there's actually quite a nice combination represented there in terms of recruitment. There are those that are recruited through either ALS clinics or sites that they contract to do this. We also have one that is actually splitting their recruitment and they're using SynaptiCare in order to ensure that they can go out to remote areas that might not be close to clinics and otherwise would not have had an opportunity to participate. And so it's nice to see that an attempt to meet that need. And then on the Beauty Last EAP, like I said, just got approved by NIH within not quite even a month yet. And that particular one is looking to offer a feature for the neurologists outside of clinics that may have ALS patients and they want to be able to participate and recruit on behalf of the patients that they take care of. And so there's a number of sites that are reserved for that purpose. So we're seeing a lot of different creative ways on how to reach out to the general ALS community, some of which fall outside the more standard, ALS clinics or even Healy platform sites, with that concerted effort to ensure that more access or more distributed, the access is distributed better throughout the country.
And Nancy had another question. Do ALS patients commonly seek EAPs?
So
Go
ahead, Dan.
Right. I was going to say that's an interesting question because in ALS, it's only recently and mainly through the Act for ALS that that there's been an initiative or a momentum for expanded access. I believe the first EAP was 2010 or 2012 that never was implemented because the drug failed in phase 3. But most of them don't. It just hasn't even been an option until the Act for ALS.
Thanks, Dan. Ken asked, what are the main concerns or criticisms about the first rounds of the EAP you have heard that can and should be addressed?
I can offer at least my particular take on it. I think as a person living with ALS, the time that from the time that a grant is approved to the time that that first dosage is administered falls outside of what we would desire or prefer. And so I think that there's probably efficiencies that can be built into that process. But I also have to recognize that as in any new process, there's always going to be a few kinks to work out. And so we're very hopeful that as more EAP programs or grants are approved, that we'll be learning and applying some of those process changes to make it more efficient and therefore faster to get treatments into bodies.
And it is a lot of moving parts. I mean, Diane and I first got involved with IAMALS advocating for a mutual friend, dear friend, who was desperately trying to get drug under expanded access and was denied repeatedly by the company. And even after the company relented, which took 2 months, I think it was, then the process, starting with the physician and the institution, took another 6 weeks. Even with just for one person who was highly motivated and supported by knowledgeable people trying to move it along. But I think Sonya's comment was really important too.
I was going to also just say, I think the first round of EAP criticism was addressed by Congress already in regards to the multi-year awards, and Congress corrected that, and that hasn't happened since that first year. So that's the most identifiable one that I think is able to be identified, since everything else is still just ongoing.
Okay, well, we are at the top of the hour. So I just want to thank our panelists for providing us with the information and the presentation. And like I said, we will be sending everyone who registered for this webinar the recording as well when it's uploaded to YouTube. And we'll also have the links that we mentioned throughout the presentation with the slides. So thank you everyone for coming. Thank you to our panelists. And I think our next webinar is not scheduled yet, but hopefully will be in November. So please keep an eye out for that. Thank you so much, everybody. Take care.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hey, stay safe, Troy, just in case. Okay, good. You're still on. Yeah, stay safe and keep us posted if you keep your Wi-Fi.
Okay, I will.